Today, for our sermon, I thought what I'd like to do is first of all give you an illustration, and it's probably no surprise that it comes from a part of my life in recent times of travelling and taking people to Reformation times and places. One of those places is Prague, and that's where we're going to go today, and we're going to, forgot to turn this on, and we're going to have a look around Prague just to see what stands out. And it's interesting to notice that one of the things that stands out in Prague, which is the capital of the Czech Republic, one of the things that stands out is all the monuments and the sculptures and statues that surround the city. And one of the first ones, of course, that we look at is the one that's connected with Yonder. And he's the one standing tall on this particular statue. And it's a very large structure, actually, this sculpture, because it not only has him standing tall on one side and very prominent because of the Reformation truth that he brought to the city of Prague, but as you walk around this very large sculpture, you begin to see the sad story of what happened about 200 years to the Hussite followers. And it kind of is a two-sided story. And for that purpose, I guess it really captures the imagination of many people as well. And so that's one statue that really stands out. One of the ones that probably stands out best to me, and by the way, if you want this story, it's in great controversy too. It's a story about this man called Žižka. And what you're looking at the moment is actually the National War Memorial of the Czech Republic. And the man sitting upon this horse, called Žižka, is regarded by the Czech people, and other people too, by the way, recognise this as one of the greatest warriors of all times in leading people into battle. He's a Hussite, never lost a battle. And as you can see probably by the larger photo there, he actually is blind over one eye for most of those battles because he lost his eye in battle, in an early battle. But before he finished, he actually lost his second eye as well, but continued as a general and never lost those battles. It's just an incredible story. And as I said, his story is recorded in the book of Great Controversy with the story of Jan Hus. St. Wenceslas Square. Now, I've always puzzled about this. Why do they call it a square? Because it's actually a very, very long, very wide street. And now we're at the other end of it, looking back when there's not so many people on it. But you can see right there, prominent in the square, there is another equestrian, I guess, structure. And upon that structure, there sits now St. Wenceslas. And he obviously is a very prominent person because from here on, as we're going to find out, just about everywhere you go, you find statues or structures or paintings or brass plaques on church doors that connect with Wenceslas. And so I found this very fascinating. This is not him, by the way. This is just another brass plaque that happens to be sitting there. Did I do something? Or he was back again. There, just walking. And where we really want to go is up to the cathedral that you see on the top of the picture, which is the centre of the large castle that surrounds the cathedral. Because up there's a lot of reference also to St. Wenceslas. So we've got to cross the Charles Bridge. But in crossing the Charles Bridge, and you can see even in this photograph as you look at it, there are little spikes sticking up. Get in a little bit closer and you'll recognise, so there are people walking across the bridge, and notice there on the side there is a statue standing up, and we'll go in a little bit closer to this particular one. It's one of their saints. And apparently, if you touch where that lady is reaching out and placing her hand on this particular part of the monument and the plaque that's below the saint, if you touch that, it's a good luck charm. And I tell you what, it's very shiny in those two places where people are constantly touching that. Even people in our group were doing that. I think I have a photo of actually Helen reaching out, doing that, if I remember, Bob. But I forgot about it while I was putting this together. I should have looked that one up. But just up a bit further from that, there is a sculpture there of three of the saints. These three saints had been monarchs. The one standing in the middle and the tallest is Wenceslas. And it's interesting that he just figures, in fact, not just once, but twice on the bridge, actually. And so when we get up to the cathedral, now this is a massive cathedral. And actually, since Wenceslas, later on, we'll just share a little bit about it, that middle spire going up there sits over what's called the rotunda. And that's where he started building this particular church. So as we go up to this church, you can't escape the building with the little pink slats in it on the left-hand side of the picture there. I've never really worked out what the building was for, other than it does have public toilets on the other side, as long as you pay the right amount of krona for it. And it's always in great need when we are touring there. And so I only know the building for that purpose. But once we get beyond that, we get into the cathedral, and then your mind is just blown away by the massive stained glass windows in this cathedral. Colourful, and as you go around, and look, I just popped a couple in here just to illustrate this to you, but as you go around, it's very obvious that there's a recognition of many saints in this cathedral. And one of them is, guess who? St. Wenceslas. Now, you notice I've spelt it differently. It's not a spelling mistake, because it's spelt the two ways, ending with LAS or LAUS. Both ways, sometimes favoured more in the cathedral and as a saint as with the AS spelling, but not always, and it just depends where you find the reference as to how they spell it. So I've tried to be loyal to that. But this is what is interesting, and I didn't even see this. There was no photographs in my first year of going to this. And it wasn't until later on that I found it. There is a whole chapel there dedicated to St. Wenceslas. It's his chapel. And if you look right in the centre, now I would like to point to it with a red thing, but you won't see that on the screen. But right in the centre of the picture, there is this. It is a Gothic statue of St. Wenceslas with a couple of angels around him. And this is obviously very central and prominent in that chapel. I'll talk about the chapel later. It is under, by the way, it's in that rotund part that I was talking about. We'll come to it a little later in the story. All right, so we leave that particular cathedral and notice that just down the street a bit, there's another church. This one's called St. Wenceslas Basilica, or church, large church. And it not only, and while I've pointed the arrow in above the entry doorway there is a picture of St. Wenceslas. There are others inside. It was too dark for them to actually be able to be shown on the screen. But, and much note about Wenceslas again, obviously being a church that was dedicated to him. And by the way, while I was doing my research on that church, it's interesting to notice that there are scores. Well, maybe that's an exaggeration. I remember seeing clearly at least a good half a dozen other churches outside of Prague and around, some even in America, that are also dedicated to St. Wenceslas. So it's a very common thing, and obviously this man is a pretty important man, and I want to know a bit more about him. Another church that we happen to find just below that equestrian one of Ziska up on the hill. This is a church which is actually dedicated to two saints, and those two saints apparently were responsible for bringing Wenceslas' father and grandfather to Christianity. And here they have a church dedicated to these two saints, and guess what? Plaques on the door and inside again, there is just constant reference to the man Wenceslas, and you see them here in this particular brass plaque, and there's another couple that one's not so good with the lighting there, but they are, again, photographs of St. Wenceslas featured on the door of this particular church. All right. Now, as you walk around the city, I won't stop to talk what's the significance of each one of these, but you just continue to see it everywhere. It's St. Wenceslas is being recognised here in this monument or this statue or whatever it is. A couple more again. And so it just continues. It's constant. And even today, the 20 krona coin has St. Wenceslas on him still. And looking on the internet, over the years, there have been scores of coins that have come out with St. Wenceslas on the coins. We change our monarch as they change. But no, Wenceslas over the centuries is getting recognition still on the coins. This man must be a pretty significant person. Who is he? First of all, we've found out that he's clearly a saint because of the constant reference to him. The church has made him a saint. But also we've understood that he's a king, he's a monarch. All right, or so history tells us. Now, we'd like to find out a little bit about him. What does history tell us about this man? I've got up on the screen now, I'm not quite sure I'm not going to go all through these in detail, but I just want to show you that in Bohemian, now Bohemian is the old name for the Czech Republic, or Czechoslovakia was the name in between before we called one part of it Czech Republic. That was the old name Bohemia, all right? And it's interesting to notice that in history there are 5 St Wenceslas's who have come from royal descent and have taken control and leadership in the country at some stage or another. Now, the first one you can see starts in the 10th century. I'm going to go backwards. Let's go down to the bottom one, Wenceslas IV, who was king of Bohemia. The reason why I want to start with him is I thought all these statues were of him, because when John Huss was there in Prague doing his work, not long after he became an official priest, and because of his high standing in the university, etc., and his qualifications, he became the confessor to the Queen, Queen Sophia. And Queen Sophia became so impressed with him and her connections now notice this, Queen Sophia was married to, as we've said, Wenceslas IV, and his sister was Queen Anne in England, married to King David II. Of England, I think it was, King David II. And she became a great supporter of John Wycliffe. And so you can appreciate that communication was going on, particularly between the 2 sister-in-laws. And this influenced also Wenceslas IV. And so he gave Huss protection in his kingdom, right up to the end. Both of them did, actually. They supported him, and right up until finally when the Pope gave him a final edict of condemnation, and then he was called to trial down in Constance, etc. Right up until that time they supported, but then they turned against him and they deserted him, which was a sad story. And so I thought, maybe this is the good king that we're seeing, the saint that we've seen all around the place. But it turns out it wasn't. In fact, he's actually known as Wenceslas the Idle. At one stage, he was even the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. But he did such a weak job for such a short time, he got pushed aside just to care for smaller countries out there. But anyway, that was Wenceslas the IV. No reference have I seen as we've been walking around as a monument to this man at all, even though he gave that support to Huss. I want to go back and show you that from between the 10th, there are 3 other St Wenceslas's who become king, 1, 2, 3, and then Wenceslas IV. The one before all of them in the 10th century, in the early 900s AD, was known as the St Wenceslas, the Duke of Bohemia. Until after he died, the church thought posthumously he should be called not only saint, but also he should be called king. And so guess what they did? This is what they did to him. So I've moved him up, taken the title off, moved him up. These are the names that this man has since Wenceslas of the 10th. First of all, we know him already as Saint Wenceslas, as well as being the Duke of Bohemia. He also, by the church, was called St Wenceslas I, but not recognised by the later St Wenceslas. And obviously, in fact, he wouldn't have been called the first until probably those later ones came along. But they were saying, no, we are the only official ones, because he was never crowned as king. He was only the Duke for his period of reign. He also was known as Good King Wenceslas. Now you're on board, aren't you? You all know that Christmas carol. And so this is the story of St. Wenceslas. All around Prague, he is honoured. He's honoured on statues, he's honoured on sculptures, he in the cathedral, he has a chapel dedicated to him, and it just goes on and on and on. What makes this man such a good king? Just a hymn that was written about 800 years after him? Is that what makes him a good king? How reliable is that story? So let's see if we can just quickly find out, our good Samaritan of the 10th century, a little bit about St. Wenceslas. And now the pictures will slow down while I just share a little, if I may, about him and his background. I'm going to leave this one picture on, which I like, probably one of the best pictures of all of him, but it's the one that used to be in the St. Wenceslas Square right in the middle of Prague. But, it's got too old now, so they took it aside, put it in an old park. It's totally overgrown by bush almost, but I reckon it's one of the best ones. So anyway, this is his story again. When he was born, he was born into a family of pagan, they were from, the ruling people there in Bohemia, but they were pagan at this stage. But his grandfather and father became Christian, and Wenceslas became very much influenced by that, but not from his mother. She remained pagan, apparently did get baptised to get married, but she remained pagan. And the interesting thing is that she did everything she could to try and persuade Wenceslas, who's going to become the Duke of Bohemia, persuade him against becoming Christian and running a Christian monarchy. Well, she failed. The father died when Wenceslas was only 13. At 18, he became the official ruling duke in Bohemia. And from there on, in fact, one of the kind of a sad thing that he did, but he felt it was necessary because of the influence of his mother, he actually exiled her out of the country so that she couldn't be influencing with her pagan ideas. In fact, it was interesting to note that her mother was actually the daughter of a pagan priest. So you can see that she had a very strong influence in that area. All right, so Wenceslas then, at the age of 18, he begins to rule the kingdom of Bohemia as the Wenceslas, the Duke of Bohemia. That was his name. And I have identified here from the various articles that I've read, I have identified the various qualities of this man that the people recognised. This is history, people. This is nothing to do yet with the hymn. First of all, it was regarded that he ruled and reigned with mercy and justice. Very fair the way he dealt with the circumstances that he had to deal with. And the people loved him for this. He was a beloved leader at this time. Secondly, he was described as being very kind and generous and was known for his acts of kindness. Oh, now we're getting closer to the hymn. To the carol. And so, in fact, there is a chronicler coming in the next century who wrote this about St. Wenceslas. He says, "But his deeds I think you know better than I can tell you, for as is read in his passion," this is something that he wrote, no one doubts that, "rising every night from his noble bed, with bare feet and only one chamberlain, or page, as we have in the carol, he went around to God's churches and gave alms generously to widows, orphans, those in prison, and those afflicted by every difficulty, so much so that he was considered not a prince, but a father of the wretched." He was a good man, wasn't he? And we'd love to have him as the ruler here, or any country would love to have this man as their ruler. And also, he had a policy of being peaceful about his negotiations and his relationships with countries around. When it seemed that war was imminent, he would go out and talk and negotiate, and so prevent his country having to go for war. However, there was a brother that wasn't happy about this. he was influenced by his mother. And so we have the record, and I think did I throw in here? No, I haven't, sorry, I didn't. I did at one stage, but I took it out again, I'm sorry. But we have the record, and there are several, there's even on brass plaques on church doors and so on, there are scenes of what happens next. He had only ruled for 10 years. And his brother, known as Wenceslas the Cruel, he is responsible for the murder of his brother and cast the last Lancelot into him to make sure he's dead. And that brought St Wenceslas to a very quick end, obviously. He was actually on his way to church early in the morning when this took place. And as a result of that, the medieval church that he was clearly a strong supporter of in his reign, they immediately recognised him as being not only somebody who deserved to be king, entitled the king, and that's where now the name King of Bohemia comes from, after his death, but also he was almost immediately pronounced a saint, Saint Wenceslas, because of the way he was treated and because of the supposed miracles that he performed, one of which is hinted at in the Christmas Carol. One thing I haven't mentioned in his story, just before we to leave him and go to the Christmas Carol, is the fact that not long after he began to reign, he believed that a relic that he had obtained, I've not been able to find out how he obtained such a relic, but he obtained a relic which was the arm of St Vitus. All right, now St Vitus goes back a little bit, but here we have this saint called St Vitus, and he has the arm. Oh, what a relic. And apparently he desires it to be kept in a safe place in a church somewhere. And the situation there in Prague, which was only just really beginning to get this strong influence from the medieval church, they really didn't have a good church. And so he decides to build one. And if you go back to that picture that we had before, and I thought I did, just let me shoot. No, it's definitely not there. All right. But you remember where I pointed out to you the rotund in the cathedral? Okay. He actually designed and had a cathedral-style church, but it never became a true cathedral. But a cathedral-style church there, he designed it, and they began to build it, and the foundations were laid by the time his brother took his life. And the purpose for that was to keep the relic of St Vitus's arm, and of course the cathedral today is called St Vitus Cathedral. But what that chapel in the rotund area, because some 300 years later it was rebuilt, and this is one of the longest building programs in Christendom, 600 years from it was the 14th century when they began to build what you see today as the present St Vitus Cathedral. And for 600 years they continued building that and built over the top and included some of the structure that Sir Vitus had, that Wenceslas had planned to be there. All right? And of course, one of the reasons why they preserved it is because now he is buried there in the chapel. All right? And of course, the chapel or the whole cathedral was completed, its construction, in the last century, in the 20th century. All right, so that's the story of St Wenceslas from history. That's reliable. Now, a hymn that is written in the 18th century, so 8 centuries after the event that it describes, has been challenged on its reliability. But maybe you can see that there is a connection to what's happening in the story, although the details may not be seen necessarily in history, but the principles seem to be there, and it's probably a fairly accurate account. In fact, it is said that the author, who by the way was a British man in the 19th century, John Mason Neale, he was the one who created the words for the carol. And then he attached it to a 13th century tune called Tempest Adest Floridum, if I have got that right, which means and it was all about in praise of the spring in a very, very pagan context. And so here we have, this tune that we have today has come from that. It's a 13th century tune and words that arose at that time. And we believe from what now we are able to understand about the creation of this carol that he tried to be as factual as he possibly could, particularly relying on the information from the Passion, or the Passion as it was called, of Wenceslas, and relying on that information he created a carol. Now you probably only remember the first line or two, and I'm not going to sing the rest of it to you either. But let me just, in conclusion of talking about St. Wenceslas, let me just, if I may, just share a little bit of the essence of this, the hymn. And maybe you haven't even sung the full 5 verses. But if you sing the full 5 verses, this is basically what we're dealing with. The page asks, sorry, let me start first of all with Wenceslas looks out the window on a winter's. It was in the deep of winter and snow on a winter's evening, and he watches a poor man collecting wood on this very cold winter's night. And so he calls in his page, as the hymn uses the word page, calls in his page or servant and asks him, where does that man live? And he found out that that man lived, the response comes in the hymn, that he lives down by the fence of, and I have, there it is, by St. Anne's, no it's not, it's by Saint Agnes fountain. Aha, so he finds out, he tells the page then, go and get meat and milk and wood, we're going down. And so the two of them go out in this bitter cold. And this is, by the way, what's called St. Stephen's Day, which if you know your saints' days, that's Boxing Day. All right, this is on St. Stephen's Day that this is all taking place. And they go out on this very cold evening, and before very long, the hymn or the carol talks about how the poor page is freezing. And the king turns to him and says, mark my footsteps, my page, tread thou in them boldly. Thou shalt find winter's rage freeze thy blood less coldly. And the page responds and says, yes, as I walk in your footsteps, my feet are warmed. Kind of a miracle here. And it was taken as such, and so maybe led to part of the reason why he gained sainthood. And then it eventually tells the story how he reaches the poor man who's just finding it so difficult to survive on this winter's day, gives him the food, the meat and the milk and the wood for his fire, and it concludes then by saying, therefore, Christian men, be sure wealth or rank possessing, ye who know will bless the poor, shall yourself find blessing. Sounds a little bit like it's blessed. It's more blessed to give than receive, doesn't it? Is that a motive for the purpose of doing what he did? I would like to now, for the remainder of our time, in the conclusion of our sermon today, I would now like to just take that story and just simply say to you, I honestly believe from the records of history and from the hints in the Christmas carol, and next time you sing it, you may see some more connections there. I'd like to suggest that Wenceslas was a 10th century Good Samaritan. He understood what it was to go out in the cold against the odds, as a Samaritan was doing there in this Jewish context. And as he was then coming, and that should have been up when I was talking about the actual carol, I'm sorry. But I want to go to the next one. I want to just have a look at this. In the scripture reading, 2 words were used. And I chose a translation here for the reading of the scripture that really, I believe, sort of brought this out nicely. And that is in verse 33. It talks about the Samaritan coming to the poor, beaten up Jewish man. And it says he has compassion, he has pity on this man. He cleans up, he binds up his wounds, he puts them on his donkey, and he walks now instead of riding, and goes all the way to the inn. And you know what? He hands over to somebody better qualified for him to take care of him, and says in the morning as he's departing, handing over his 2 silver coins, if there is any more, this man is going the 2nd mile, if there is any more that this man is owed from caring for him, I will pay it next time I come back. He truly was the Good Samaritan, and I believe if you look at that story and look at St Wenceslas' story, we see that there are lots of parallels, because here was a man who regularly, according to the records of that time, or soon after his time, who regularly would go out into difficult situations, even sometimes barefooted, and would feed those who needed to be fed, who would help those who needed to be helped, and became a great influence for kindness and for goodness. Now, as we look at this and we look at this story, and by the way, I know Christmas has gone, and you could probably say, oh, this would have been a good Christmas Day sermon. Well, I'm sorry I wasn't here for that. But I think it's a good 365 day of the year story. Because even though this has a context of as being origin for Boxing Day, the day after Christmas Day, and there's an English connection with that as well, I think the lessons of this story are important for us all the time. And when we start looking at the concepts of compassion and mercy, I don't want you to think only of charity or only of money or helping somebody who is in need financially or something like that. Now, that's a part of it, yes, and many people are able to very generously help in those areas. I want you also to think that there are times we can offer kindness to people through our support of them in other ways, giving a hand, giving of our own time, and doing deeds of kindness for them. Even in our words. And boy, I said that this sermon is one for me too. And as as it was all coming together, I thought, yeah, look, Lord, there are times when my words are harsh. But this story is telling us that those people who are appreciated, and I believe those people who are representing the character of God, their words are words of kindness, words of sympathy, words of support. And that's a very important part of it as well. I'd like to also just suggest to you, what was the motivation for all this? What was the motivation for Wenceslas, for example, for him to do what he did? Now remember, he came from the medieval church period, where it was believed your actions had more to do with your eternal destiny than did Christ's actions. And one would be tempted to say that maybe this was his motivation. But when you look deeper at the story, I think not. I think this man had come to the place where he recognised he had the ability, he had the means to be able to share and make somebody else's life better. And in that sense, I believe he was doing what we are admonished to do, and that is as a result of the relationship that we have with Jesus Christ, that we have a desire to make other people's lives better. Not for God, because God is saying, I'll use you as a channel in order that it may draw attention to me, but you get no credit for this because I've given you the gift full and free. It's complete. And so, as we look at this, I wonder if, for example, the proverb 19 verse 7 sometimes becomes motivation for us in doing good. Proverbs 19 verse 17 says, "He who is kind to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will reward him for what he has done." Is it just for a reward that you're doing these things? I think Jesus gave the answer when he gave the parable about the sheep and the goats. And you remember at the end of that parable that the people who were told, enter into my kingdom because you've done all these good deeds, they said, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison, or go to visit you? The king replied, I tell you the truth. Whatever you did for one of the least of these brethren of mine, you did it to me. They didn't consider what they were doing was gaining them any access to God, but it came as a spring out of their life. And this is why I would like to turn to my last text for today, is in Galatians 5, verse 22, 23, verses that we know extremely well. These verses say, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness. I'm particularly taking that word, I guess, today. Goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such there is no law. These are the fruit of the Spirit. Not fruits, fruit of the Spirit. This is what appears in the life of all those people who've accepted the gift. The spontaneous outworking of the Spirit in the life is to bring this fruit and share God's love, God's joy, God's peace, God's forbearance, God's kindness, His goodness, His faithfulness, His gentleness, and His self-control, to share it with those in greater need than ourselves. Father in heaven, in those wonderful words of life, we read of your wonderful gift. Thank you. And we pray, Lord, that our life may be a witness to you, and the life that you can bring to others too is the prayer we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.